So here we have an Epiphone Les Paul Muse that I've been working on, and it's a very lovely guitar, one that I'm quite interested to play with. It's also not that expensive, especially since I got a pretty good deal on it second hand. Now, I think this guitar has a lot of features that make it very interesting. It has a slimmer neck than a lot of Les Pauls out there. It has switching down to single coil and out of phase. It has a comfort body carve on the back. Lots of good stuff that make this a nice little practical cheap guitar that would be good maybe for carrying around pubs doing gigs and things. The one thing I feel that lets it down and lets the entire series down is that it has a Laurel fretboard, which is quite common on guitars around this price point at the moment. The problem with Laurel, well, there's not really any problem with Laurel. It's actually a pretty good wood for making fretboards out of, and it's usually easier to get a hold of than more traditional rosewood. The downside is that it can often be quite light in colour, and if you're someone like me who likes quite a dark fretboard, that can be a little bit off-putting. Now, if truth be told, this Laurel fretboard actually isn't all that light. They can be a lot lighter. I would class this as a fairly dark one actually, but it's still a little bit lighter than what I would like. So I thought I might have an experiment with trying to darken it. So the first thing I did was get another piece of Laurel to experiment with. Now you can tell that this is much lighter than the piece that has actually been used to make this fretboard. Unfortunately, obviously because I didn't make the fretboard myself, I can't get a piece that's going to match exactly without buying a large sample of Laurel, and I really don't want to do that. But I do have some stains to hand that I want to experiment with using this scrap of wood, and we'll see if we can get some kind of idea as to what we think it might look like if we try and apply them to the guitar. First thing I want to try is rubbing in some teak oil using a mild abrasive. A mild abrasive would normally be used when applying an oil finish to a guitar, not when applying basic fretboard oils, but that just serves a purpose of whipping up a little bit of sawdust into the oil and helps it to fill gaps. I don't really like having gaps on a fretboard. So if we look at that, when it's wet, the oil certainly serves to bring out the lovely grain of the wood, and it will look a little bit darker, but not by a great deal. We'll leave that on a little while and allow it to go tacky before wiping it off. Meanwhile, we have another oil finish to try, which is a Danish oil infused with what is hopefully quite a dark but also slightly reddish rosewood dye. Now, while I can see that definitely has a little bit of dye in it, definitely has some colour to it, once it's on there, the colour doesn't seem that different from what we've already applied. Might have had a little bit of redness there. I'm just going to allow that again to soak in for a little while before removing the excess. I'm now going to try wiping on some straight up wood dyes using tissue from the order of which I expect to be lightest to darkest, and we'll see what those look like. First one up is supposedly Indian rosewood. I also forgot my gloves today, so I'm trying to be careful not to dye myself. The next one up is walnut. Doesn't say what kind of walnut, but walnut nonetheless. We're obviously working with a wood that already has a fair bit of natural pigment when you compare it to something like pine, so I'm not seeing a great difference. in these dyes. Now let's try something a little bit more serious. This is ebony wood dye. I can see that my white marks are much more apparent with that. Definitely looks to be something where we want to be a little more careful about wiping off excess and making sure we don't leave too much on there. Give that another bit just to be sure. I think I'm going to let that soak in rather than wiping it off this time. And finally, a slight oddball. Not sure if this is suitable or not, but I inherited this in a box of finishes and it is labelled as dark naphtha stain. So why not? Let's have a go at that. I'm hoping the fact that it says it's infused with naphtha means it's quite thin and will soak in quite well. So these are still drying and do need rubbed back somewhat. But my immediate impressions are that if you're looking for something that's just going to slightly darken an extremely light Laurel fretboard but keeping its kind of subdued matte quality, then the Indian rosewood or mahogany dyes both seem perfectly reasonable. Obviously we need to rub back this oil finish yet, but they do give a nice gloss appearance which seems to bring out the wood grain, and I would say either of those would look acceptable on fretboard also, but what they don't do is really colour it any more beyond its natural pigment. But it does look a little bit darker as a result of having that oil on there. The ebony, now that it's had time to soak in, if I just rub that back a little bit, it looks to me like it could get quite a convincing ebony result, but what I'd be really worried about with that is once you start to scratch at it with the strings or anything and you start to wear away the top surface, you might get some very light wood showing through, and I'm not too sure about how that would look. The darkened naphtha I very much like the look of. I don't know if it's because the naphtha hasn't fully evaporated off yet. If I just wipe off some excess, that is giving a nice darkening effect and also adding some gloss, which is really showing off a kind of chatoyance within the wood. Kind of 3D effect almost. So I definitely like the dark naphtha, and I also very much like the natural oil finishes as well. I'm just going to try wiping those back a little bit just to see if that makes much of a difference. I know they've only had about 5 minutes on there to sort of tack up, but we'll see what wiping the excess off looks like. So yeah, very little difference between the teak oil and the Danish oil, I would say. After one coat, I could almost quite happily put the two side by side and I think they'll be fine. I'd say the Danish oil is a little bit more glossy than the teak oil, but they both look lovely. But definitely nowhere near as dark when compared with the naphtha. What I'm now tempted to do is take some plain oil or even that Danish oil actually, and put some over the top of the other finishes that we've tried, just to see what happens. Just let that sink in for a moment. While I go and try and wash some of this dye off my hands. Okay. So final verdict. I would say just about anything, be it dye based or oil based, that is in that kind of Indian rosewood or walnut kind of range will give you a nice subtle darkening effect that will still look very natural and bring out the natural grain. Certainly what I've done here with the ebony, at a distance I think looks okay, but it just looks a little bit too unnatural up close. The darkened naphtha I think is my favourite, in that it definitely seems to give a noticeable darkening effect but remains very subtle, and it does seem to take oil over the top okay as well. While we're here, I think I would like to try one further experiment using the other side, and that is to try taking the ebony and combining it kind of in a similar way as this dark naphtha has probably been made. I want to try combining it with oil and also with thinners of some kind to see if that results in a more noticeable darkening effect than these, but with a more natural look than raw ebony. So first off, I have a completely unscientific concoction made up primarily of teak oil with a splash of the ebony dye and also a little bit of alcohol to thin it down. These are probably not things that mix all that well together, but let's see what they look like anyway. That looks like it's soaking in and could possibly do with another coat. The next concoction is just to take some of that dark naphtha and basically add a bit more ebony dye to it. Naphtha of course is evaporating off pretty quickly and I want to get rid of any excess, so I'll just give that a little bit of a rub. It's looking a little bit streaky in places. I wonder if covering it in alcohol, giving it a bit of a wipe, will just allow me to blend that. So let's give that 5 minutes to dry off and then we'll come back and decide upon the results. Final verdict. If we look back at our original stains, the individual oil and also the oil with rosewood still in it are barely any difference between the two. So much so I'd say it's probably not even worth considering. The two lighter dyes that we tried, which were the Indian rosewood, and I think it was walnut, yeah. Very similar. I think the Indian rosewood actually seems to look a little bit better to my eye. It even comes out a little darker as far as I can see. I suppose it's no surprise that a rosewood dye on a rosewood sort of family piece of wood is going to work. The ebony, to be quite honest with you, I think I'd stay clear of that. It looks too matte, too powdery, and unfortunately natural ebonies, they just don't have the red in them that the rosewood type woods do, and unless you're going to completely mask that redness underneath, then it's just not going to work. The naphtha, the dark naphtha, I have to say I quite like that, and it really does add a shimmer or a chatoyance, or however you pronounce that, which I think is fantastic. I'd be quite happy to use that on my guitar. Looking at the other side, our concoctions, these didn't look as good to me until I actually experimented with a little bit of wax over the top, and now I actually quite like them. I think the oil with the added ebony stain in doesn't really produce effects any better than what the naphtha does. The naphtha with a little bit of added ebony, however, I think looks fantastic. If I was going to try and produce a really dark piece of rustic furniture or something like that, it would be brilliant. It does look... Again, we have that problem where we're starting to get very dark, but we can see the natural reds of the wood still coming through, which certainly doesn't look like... It doesn't really look like a dark rosewood to me, and it doesn't look like an ebony. If anything, it looks more like some treated rustic oak or something like that, but I really do like the effect. So the question is, do I want to try any of these on an actual guitar? And I think the answer is yes. What I've decided is, if we look at the fretboard of the guitar once more, it's already darker than the sample piece of wood that we were using. And it's got my biggest pet peeve on these kind of boards, which is quite an open grain, which has got lots of probably dead skin and metal down in it, so you get this kind of like light, almost greenish kind of dirt building up between the grain. Now I could painstakingly go at that with, like, say, a needle or something like that to try and clean the worst of it out, but then I'm just left with open grain that's going to fill up again. If I wanted to, I could do that and then maybe try and fill the grain with a high build oil and a bit of wire wool or something like that. But what I'm actually hoping is, if we just leave that grain filled as it is, using the dark naphtha over the top might actually seep some of the dye into that muck. It might make it a little bit less apparent while effectively leaving grain filled. So I think my mind's made up. I'm going to try the dark naphtha on the fretboard. Let's give it a whirl. So after a little bit of experimentation on a piece of scrap, I have decided to go ahead and try and darken the fretboard a little bit using this Fides dark naphtha wood dye, which I would assume is effectively some kind of ebony or similar dye mixed in with naphtha. I'm going to rub that in with a little bit of wire wool, just so that if there is any remaining dirt or grime on the fretboard, it at least at the very least tries to sort of lift it up a bit, and it will just hopefully try and get a more seamless integration with the wood. One important thing to note before I start, I'm doing this on a guitar which has plastic, or what I would call mother of toilet seat, inlays. if you were going to attempt this on a guitar which has natural mother of pearl inlays, you need to be very careful, because mother of pearl will be much more susceptible to absorbing dyes, and then you might end up with coloured inlays which you may not want. It might be possible to rub them back or sand them back a little bit to get rid of any unwanted dye, but do be careful. Again, I have a neck which is effectively painted black, and it's also a poly finish which isn't going to react straight away to a little bit of thinner, so I'm not too worried about really getting this places it shouldn't be. This wire wool has absorbed rather a lot of it compared to what I thought it might. I really do hope that inlay is going to be okay, otherwise we're going to have a hell of a clean-up job. I have gone kind of gung-ho here instead of testing it on my plastics, because to be honest with you, I'm not really that precious when it comes to little things on my guitars. I'm not all about keeping them pristine unless it really is some kind of special collector's piece, which of course this isn't. Okay, I've clearly got a bit too much on there, but I'm going to give it a couple of minutes there just to soak in. It's looking very good to me so far. I will reserve full judgment until it dries, but that really does seem to have done what I hoped in terms of effectively dyeing any muck to match the fretboard, which is great. Okay, it's looking good. I'm going to now get this tape off and try and clean up any plastics as best I can. I think it's funny because I thought the binding was cream, but as I go at it with this a little bit, I can see that I think the binding was more of a white, really. And I think over time it's just aged naturally, which is a nice thing. Could get someone to come in and smoke all over it or something to try and speed that up if I really wanted to. But no, it's looking good. It's looking good. As I say, this stuff's a little bit controversial because most people would say, well, you only want to use super thin oils that are going to go in and sort of replenish the natural oils in the wood. Something like this, which actually contains beeswax, is actually going to go some way towards sealing the wood and stopping oils getting in or out, which if you're trying to stop them getting out, I would say is a good thing, but if you're trying to stop them getting in, when you come to apply a feature coat of oil, well, that's obviously a bad thing. So it sort of swings and roundabouts. I think the real concern was always that regardless of what you're doing with it, it might sort of gunk up over time and you might end up with sludge on the guitar fretboard, just kind of accumulating. I've heard of a lot of people actually using this online who've reported that they've been occasionally treating their guitar with it for a number of years and they've not really reported any problems, so that gives me confidence to try it on a cheaper guitar at least. Just going to allow that to soak for a few moments. So that's had about 5 or 10 minutes just to soak in there. Just going along and wiping off the excess, which is lifting off what is probably a combination of some dirt and the dye. And there we have it. I must admit I forgot to take a before and after photo, but hopefully I shall in the edit be able to do you a side-by-side comparison in the video, and you can tell me what you think in the comments below. But certainly from where I'm standing, I'm not sure how well it's coming out on the video, but that looks like a lovely dark rosewood fretboard to me. And if it holds that colour when I come back to it in a day or two, I will be very, very happy. Please do let me know what you think in the comments below. Please let me know if you tried any similar methods. I'd be very keen to hear what you think. Goodbye.